Good morning, everyone. I'm thankful to be here. Sorry, my family is not able to be here, but if you wonder what they look like, we do have a prayer card on the table, and I promise you they are real. They don't always travel with me. I have a 5-year-old named Emmett, and then our 3-year-old named Elliot, and my wife's name is Lena, and I love it when they're with me, but one thing I learned about 5-year-olds and 3-year-olds is they're not always super spiritual. You know, they're not always concerned about where they are, things like that. Sometimes it's easier to be able to have them home, and there's a church that we attend when we're not traveling. So I appreciate your patience, but also just being able to deal with me today and not the cutest part of my family, right? You have to look at me today, not my cute kids and beautiful wife. But I'm definitely thankful to be here, and I just want to share some things with you about Fernwood Christian Camp and a little bit about myself. You saw in the video, and one of the reasons I like to show that first is because it really says some things that get us straight to the point. We're a camp revitalization project. It was around there, I think the video skipped over the date. I think it just said 19, but it's been around since 1930. And the interesting story about the camp is that it was a family of farmers. So the camp's located in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, technically Chippewa, pretty rural part of Pennsylvania. It's becoming less and less rural as time goes by. But it was a family of farmers that had a big barn and had 110 acres, and they decided in 1930 to make it a Christian camp. So they gave it over to some churches in the area and wanted to see that camp used to reach young people. Now, since 1930 up until today, the camp changed ownership multiple times. Now, I don't have too much of the history from 1930 up until 1960, but I do know that in the early 60s, a group of Baptist churches in the Pittsburgh area, which were 40 minutes north of Pittsburgh, again, the video says it, so I'll just keep repeating what the video says. But we're 40 minutes north of Pittsburgh, so there was about, I think, 4 or 5 churches that owned the campground in the 60s. And so from the 60s to the late 80s, they ran camp. But when they ran camp, it never really grew more than 3 weeks of summer. And the camps that they did, I believe, was around probably 50 or 60 people. But the Lord blessed it back then from what I've heard. But then in 86, a lot of the churches were just shrinking in size, and they didn't have the manpower to really run the camp anymore. And the group of churches decided to close the camp and to sell it. And so that was, I believe, in 86 or 87. And so they actually ended up selling it to a like-minded Baptist church in town, which was 8 minutes away. So it's in downtown Beaver Falls, the church that used to own it. And so they gave it to, or sold it to them for $1. And when they sold it to them, the camp was a little run down, needed a lot of work, but the church, and that's Valley Baptist Church, they bought it and started to repair it and use the house that was on property as their parsonage. And they had it from the early 90s until 2020. And so they had it for about 30 years. And so when they owned the camp is kind of when I come into the picture. In the early 2000s, my church, Bible Baptist Temple in Youngstown, Ohio, I grew up there. And actually, that's the church that owns the camp now, but I'll get to that in a moment. But when I was 9, like I said in the video, my church started to rent Fernwood Christian Camp. And it actually was one of those things where my pastor, at the time, he was my youth pastor, his brother was called into camp ministry, and they found this property. He said, hey, we could do camp here. But when they found the property, it was little... I say a little, it was pretty rustic, again, a little rundown, it really wasn't used, but they wanted to start using it. In fact, I've been told stories that the shower and bathhouse that they have didn't have really any running water. It was attached to a well that didn't work that well. And so they had to use the neighbor's pool water with buckets, and that's how they would flush the toilets. And so where we are now, we're definitely improved since then. But they just knew God wanted to use that property to reach young people. So my home church started renting the property for 2 weeks out of the summer. They did a junior camp camp and a teen camp, and I came in the picture, I think it was the second year of their junior camp, and they really started with junior camp and tried to grow into a teen camp. So the first few years they did it in the early 2000s was just junior camp. So I believe it was 2001, 2002 that I started going, and I just fell in love with camp. Just fell in love with it. And the reason why I fell in love with camp was I come from I say a rough background, but it was just me and my mom growing up, come from a split home, and it was, life had its difficulties, but a lot of times it was just kind of me at home. My mom worked several jobs to be able to pay the bills. And so when I had a group of people that were there for a whole week to deal with me, and to help me and to love me, that just changed my life. Because oftentimes you and I could feel like, and I'm sure we've all been there, there's times where we feel like no one cares about us. You ever been there? You ever wake up that one morning and say, you know what, I don't think anyone cares about me anymore. I don't know where these people have gone. I haven't heard from these people. And as a boy, I just didn't have that many people in my life other than my home church and then going to camp. And can I just encourage you this morning, it was a independent Baptist church just like this one that saw the need to reach out to young people and invest in young people. And because they invested in my life is really the reason why I'm standing here today. And I told you how I went to camp when I was 9, and I didn't stop going. I kept going, but it was because of my church. They reached out to me, and when I was 9, I was starting to lose interest in the things of God. I know we put a lot of emphasis on teenagers, but 8, 9, 10-year-olds, they develop their interests, and they're developing who they're going to be even at that young age. I know that happens a little bit more when you're a teenager, but I just didn't have any interest in church. In fact, my mom, I told you she was a hard worker, and so Sunday morning she typically had off, and I as a 9-year-old would say, Mom, you should sleep in. Now, the reason I said that, I wanted to play video games. Now, when I was that age, Nintendo 64 was the video game console, and I just wanted to stay home. I wasn't interested in church. I said, Mom, you stay home, you rest. I'll be in the other room playing video games, right? So it wasn't very spiritual, but I got a phone call from our youth leader on a Saturday, and he said, hey, we're having a junior church contest. We're going to have a pizza party. And you can probably tell now, but anytime you say pizza, I'm in, right? And so he said, we're going to have a pizza party after so many weeks and kind of have a contest. We want you to come. And so they used that to get me back, and I kept coming to church since. And then my mom raised me in church, but again, there was just a time where we were starting to drift away a little bit. And so it was during that time they invited me to camp, and when I tell you I didn't stop going, I am not exaggerating. I have gone to Fernwood, I believe, let's see, do the math, I'm 30, I'll be 32 this summer. I was going since I was 9, so that's 22 years? Yeah, so this will be my 22nd summer, or actually 23rd summer, 22 years. And so I've been around Fernwood for quite a long time. And so I went to junior camp, went to teen camp. I was a junior counselor. I was a counselor. Then I was the program director. And it was actually at camp when I was 16 that I surrendered to, well, actually 14, that I surrendered to preach. Now, one of the issues about surrendering to preach, which, brother, about 10:35 or 10:30? Okay, 10:30. Which I thought at first he told me to preach till 2 in that text. No, I'm just kidding. From 10 to 2. I'm sure I would take a nap in between that. But so it was. I distract myself, brother. The more you get to know me, I told the teenagers this weekend I'm like a squirrel. I get distracted, and then I told them I'm a pretty large squirrel, so that was just my large squirrel tendency there. But when I was 14, I surrendered to preach, and the issue that I had with surrendering to preach was when I realized that's what God wanted me to do with my life. Unfortunately, I don't know why, and we'll share this a little bit more the next service, a little bit more about that, but I thought I had arrived. I thought that was the greatest spiritual decision I ever had to make. One of the reasons was churches and pastors and people get excited when a young person surrenders to preach. So I thought that was something special. But also, because I surrendered to preach, I thought, now I know what to tell you. Like I tell you what to do, right? I teach you from Scripture. And so as a 14-year-old boy, I struggled with that. And so after camp, I surrendered, preached. My pastor was giving me opportunities, and I just was not realizing that just because I surrendered to the Lord doesn't mean that I was actually serving the Lord. It's a different thing to surrender and to actually serve Him with your whole heart and mind. And so it was actually at camp again when I was 16, I surrendered my whole life over to the Lord. And I think that's very important that we as Christians do that. You and I going to church, it's not enough. Serving at church and serving in our community, it's not enough. It's about surrendering everything about us. Because how easy is it for you and I to serve and then go home and live a totally, completely different life? A life that doesn't honor God, a life that doesn't even involve God. And so I really understood that because of camp. And I truly believe, I don't know if you and your church could do this, but I truly believe one of the keys to revival in America is that God's people would stop allowing themselves to be distracted, that maybe we take a week and shut our phones off. I know life makes it difficult to do that, but can you imagine shutting your phone off, not watching TV, and just spending a week under preaching and fellowship with God's people and having fun and just being able to focus on God's love? I think it's life-changing, and I think adults need that. But again, unfortunately, we get too busy, right? And our jobs and work, I understand. I'm not saying we're wicked people for not being able to take a week of camp, but I'm saying it could definitely change us. And teenagers and young people, they have the opportunity to do that. And it is life-changing, and it's changed my life. And it was actually when I was 16 that I started praying, because you probably know this, having kids and having teenagers, that teenagers, they're aware, right? We especially when we're teenagers, we like to be in the adult business, right? We want to, listen and try to be involved. And so I knew when I was 16 that the camp did not have a camp director. The camp at that time, it was ran by that church in Beaver Falls, and all they did was they took care of the property, but our church ran the program. So they would do their best to take care of the property and do some improvements as the years went on, but they were solely in charge of the property, and we would do the program. And so I'm not joking when I said in that video that we were really the only camps that has taken place on that property for really the last 30 years. There were some camps here and there, but as far as consistency every year, we were the only group. And so I knew they needed a camp director, so I started praying when I was 16. I said, Lord, would you allow me one day to be a camp director? And I prayed that, and I meant it and wanted that, and obviously you know today that the Lord answered that prayer. But I'd like to take the next few moments to just share with you on how that happened. Now, I wasn't necessarily planning on sharing this verse, so we'll make sure if I could find it. I believe it's Psalm 37. If you take your Bible, Psalm 37, an encouraging verse I'd like to share with you. Make sure we can find it. Psalm 37. I just want to tie in a little bit of my testimony and what the Lord's doing at the camp with this. But in Psalm 37, verse number, we'll read the first 4 verses. It says, Fret not thyself because of evildoers, neither be thou envious against the workers of iniquity, for they shall soon be cut down like the grass, and wither as the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good, so shalt thou dwell in the land, and verily thou shalt be fed. Delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of thine heart. Now, the reason I wanted to share these verses with you, specifically verse number 4, is when I was 16, I prayed that I'd be a camp director. But you probably know, I'm sure, I don't know really any of you. I just met most of you today. I know I met some of the teens at a youth rally a couple months ago. But I don't really know your background. I don't know what you're dealing with. But I have been around long enough to know that we don't always get what we want when we want it when it comes to this idea of praying for something. You ever been there? You pray for something and you want it soon. You want it when you want it. But what I realize is God's ways are much higher than our ways, and God knows what he's doing, and God has a timeline that we don't always understand, and we're not always patient enough to say, well, God's not allowing this to happen, but I want it to. And we've all, at least I'll speak for myself. I won't throw you into this, but I know I have sometimes tried to force things because, one, you say, well, it's a good thing, and I want to serve God with it. He's not really opening the door, but I'm going to try to force it through. And when we do that, God doesn't always bless, does he? Because he knows what's right. He knows the timing. And so when I had that prayer, I ended up going to Bible college, and there's some things in between that I'll share later in the next service. But I went to Bible college and ended up meeting my wife at a different camp. I like to try to see other camps because I knew I was called into camp ministry. I went and saw another camp in Kentucky. It was called Camp Victory, and I went down there with another group. So I wasn't even a camper. I just went down there to work, but also observe, and that's where I met my wife. Now, when I met her, she actually came with her brother's church, and she was a helper and just was there to help her brother's group. And so when we locked eyes, when we saw each other, it was love at first sight, brother. It was just, love at first sight. For me, not for her. She was not interested at all. I tried all week to get her attention and to talk with her, and it didn't work. Now, her brother and I we were friends even before me and my wife got married, so I actually ended up we exchanged numbers, but then I kind of wanted to talk to her before we left, but I'm not joking to you, she turned her back, and she walked away from me. So I'm like, oh man, she's not interested. But then on my way home, and I was actually coming back to Massillon, that's where I went to college, and she added me on Facebook. And I thought, she loves me, right? She added me on Facebook, she loves me. So I accepted the friend request, and do you know what I started doing? I started messaging her right away, which, looking back, I probably should have waited, right? But we started messaging, and she actually decided she didn't like me, but then I prayed really hard, and she decided to get her heart right with the Lord. But no, the Lord put things into place, and we started talking, became really good friends, started courting, and then got married. But after I graduated Bible college, before we got married, I went up to work with her father, who was a pastor in Michigan. So I was an assistant pastor in Michigan for 5 years. And so went there, worked with him as an intern for 6 months. Her and I got married, became the assistant pastor. The reason why I tell you all of this is, first of all, I already told you I was born in Youngstown, Ohio. I'm a Buckeye through and through. And I wouldn't say I love Ohio. I know I'm in Ohio today, so don't hold it against me. But I would say there are some roots and some loyalty there. And so when the Lord brought me to Michigan, I wasn't super happy about it. In fact, when I first got there, I thought, how can I get back, to home, right? And my first thought really was, because I prayed when I was 16 about being a camp director at Fernwood, I thought, okay, we're going to head to Fernwood sometime. And I thought it was going to be soon. But as the years went on, and just to put a pause button on that, when I moved to Michigan and became an assistant pastor, my home church didn't know what to do with their camp program because they didn't have a camp director to do their programs anymore. And part of my college training, my last year of college, I was the intern with my pastor, and I became the program director. So now I was moving. And so the thought was, either we stop doing camp for a while, or you come back every summer and be the program director. Because some of you might say, how did you keep going to Fernwood all these years? Well, we decided that I would go and serve in Michigan, but over the summer, I would go back to Fernwood and run the programs. And so we did that about 5 years. But here was my issue. In between those years, every year I thought this was the year that I'll move to Fernwood and become the camp director. And can I tell you, each year for those 5 years, it did not happen. And I believe it was the third year in where I was discouraged and actually really tried to push my way to go there, wanted to be there, and it seemed like the Lord closed the door. And He wasn't bringing me there. And I had to realize that God didn't want me there at that time. And it was hard to accept that. I'm not kidding. It was hard. I got a little depressed, and I even thought maybe God doesn't even want me to come here anymore. Maybe I shouldn't even do the program anymore because this is what I want, but it's not happening. But then I realized something. with my desire to do something that was good, with my desire to go somewhere that, again, the Lord could bless, I was missing where God had me at the time. I was an assistant pastor in Michigan. That's where He put me. And can I say I wasn't focusing on that? So I realized, you know what, Lord? It's clearly not working for you to send me here. I'm going to fully surrender to where you have me today. And can I say that that's the best thing you can ever do? If maybe you're in Ohio, you're like, oh, I'm stuck in Ohio. And that really resonates with me because my mom, she moved from Connecticut, and my dad moved her here to actually Camel, Ohio, Youngstown. And so my dad moved us here, and then he left. And so my whole life was, I'm stuck in Ohio, because that's just kind of how life was. But that's kind of how I felt in Michigan. Like, I'm stuck here. But then I realized God called me here, and He has a reason why I'm here. And it's not like I'm on hold. You ever call somewhere, either like internet or electric company or whatever, and you're just on hold, and people don't even answer phone calls anymore. It's a robot, right? You're like, how do I talk to a robot? They don't understand. And it's either that or someone that doesn't necessarily speak the same language, right? And so it's difficult. It's not like you and I are on hold trying to tell God that He made a mistake, and so you're trying to get a hold of Him so He can fix that mistake, and that's why you're discontent. That's why you're not happy. That's why you're suffering, because you can't get God on the line to figure it out, to fix your issue. That's not how God works. You and I aren't anywhere by mistake. We're not here in Talmadge, Ohio. Did I say that right? We're not here by mistake. God knows your situation. I'm not saying that God did everything that went wrong in your life, but He knows why you went through it. He has a plan for it. And so when I was in Michigan, I realized, you know what? God's not sending me here. I'm going to focus where I am. And I said, God, I completely surrender to the youth ministry. You have me here, to the ministry here at this church, and I will stay here. Now, notice this. I still limited God, but I said, I will stay here for the next 15 years if you want me to. God, I'll focus on this ministry, and I'll still do the camp program, but that will be last priority. You've called me here. I'm on staff here, so I'm going to focus on that. And can I say, when you and I surrender to God in the situation we're in the circumstance we're in, with the surroundings we're in, when we surrender to God where we are, where He has us, He will bless. Amen. But notice, when we don't surrender where we are, right, with the circumstances, with the situation, we miss God's blessing. Sometimes you and I torment ourselves because we say, well, God put me here, and I can't do this, and I can't do that, and I can't. Well, look at what God's actually trying to do. Isn't it amazing that our God could take an uncomfortable situation or an unfortunate circumstance? He can use that still in our life. Right. He can. But how often do you and I, we try to get out of it rather than say, okay, what does God have? And I'm not saying that I'm so spiritual that, let's say, I don't know if tornadoes come through here, but let's say a tornado come through and only took my car. Now that would be a miracle, but a tornado came through and only took my car. Right now I'm not saying, all right, let's see what God's going to do. I'm going to be pretty upset at first. I mean, my car is gone, right? I'm going to be pretty confused why it's only my car that's gone. But I'm not going to say, all right, let's see how God's going to work. I'm not saying that that's our attitude. But what I'm saying is when we've taken time to be still and taken time to seek God in our own hearts, in our own lives, that God will start to show us, hey, you know what? I'm not necessarily going to tell you why I let this happen, but I'm going to move you here, and I'm going to do this with you, and I'm going to allow this to happen. There's times things click. Has that ever happened to you where you look at what's happening in your life and it clicks? Wow, I think God allowed that to happen because now this is happening. And I didn't like that over here, but I like this over here. Right? And so I shared all of that to say, when I was in Michigan and I surrendered to God where I was, He started blessing our ministry. We went from 5 teens to about 30 to 40 in about 3 months, and we saw about between 3 to 6 young people saved almost every month. It was just, it was amazing. We had 2 van routes to be able to pick everybody up. Again, we were a small country church, so we were going out into our surrounding cities and bringing them in, and God was blessing. But then about 1.5 years, as the Lord was blessing that, ministry was going well, things started to fall apart. You ever been through anything like that where things just started to fall apart? So we had a lot of our bus route move away. So they couldn't come anymore. And then we had, one thing I found out about teenagers, they don't always get along. And so we had a pretty big fight in our youth group where it pretty much had, you hear about church splits, but we had a youth group split. And so all of a sudden we were only left with about 10 teenagers. I'm wondering, like, what's going on here? But then our church started to go through some situations, and I don't want to give you too many details, but I could just tell you that I have experienced what I would call church hurt. Maybe you have as well, where I've been hurt by people that I'd never expected. And I'm sure, unfortunately, by my responses, I'm sure I've hurted, that's not a word, hurt people as well. But God made it very clear it was time to move from that ministry. It wasn't anything me and my wife did. It just became very clear, because you and I talk about God opening and closing doors. Sometimes God slams doors. Sometimes God slams doors and your hands are still, on the door jamb there. Like sometimes when God shuts a door, he makes it very evident that you need to go somewhere, or you need to be done with something, or you should stop doing something. And so I was confused. I surrendered. I said, God, I'll stay here. And then he shut that door. Me and my wife, we resigned from that ministry, and we went to go help her brother, who was a pastor about 40 minutes away. And I was just going to go into youth evangelism, didn't know what was going on, didn't understand. And so when I called my pastor over in Youngstown and said, hey, not sure what's happening, but this is what we're going to do, or at least this is what we're going to do while we seek the Lord. He said, well, it's interesting you've been through all of that, because as you've been going through that, I've been on the phone with the church that owns Fernwood, and they actually want to give us the property. They want to see what we can do with it, because we're the only church that does the programs. They don't have the manpower to really see this thing grow. They want to give it to us, and I want you to pray about being the camp director. You know what I said? I don't think, no. In fact, I said, you know what? I don't have to pray about it. Why? Because I have been praying about it. It was something that was on my radar, and God finally answered it. And so, isn't it amazing that God's timing is always best? In fact, the way he did it, everything worked out. Now, the only thing that was really interesting about it was we moved during COVID, 2020, right? My first act as camp director was to cancel camp because of everything going on. Now, we still had like a revival, but we just didn't have anyone stay over the night. But even through moving in 2020, and we also had my second born, Elliot. He was also born in November of 2020. So we officially moved there in November of 2020, and we've just hit the ground running, trying to let churches know about us, trying to raise support for the camp, that we may be able to revitalize the grounds and be able to build and to be able to grow. But the main goal is to see that property used to reach people. And oftentimes I say young people because I believe camp is a great tool to reach young people, but we want to see churches use it as well to do men's conference, ladies' conferences, marriage retreats, any way that facility and building, the property can be used to reach people and to edify the saints, to help churches. And so our main goal, and I'll be done with this, we have a vision that we're trying to revitalize what we have, but we have a vision to build a whole new camp facility out in the woods, because all of our buildings are on one corner of the property. And I mean, we have acreage where we could do a lot with. So we want what we have right now to be a retreat center, and we want to build a whole new camp facility out in the woods and to be able to hold more people and to do more. And so if you would be praying with us about that, again, our main three goals, and I think already it's on the video, but it's to raise support, to find churches to come to our camp and to use the camp. But our third goal is really to just help churches reach young people. Even if churches don't come to our camp, I think that I think one of the keys to revival, again, we kind of spun with the camp ministry, is reaching young people. And let's be honest here, most of our churches do not have young people. I believe that it's a problem, it's an issue, and if we continue not to reach young people, what's going to happen in our churches one day? They'll continue to close, and we will see our country really lost. And so our goal is to help churches reach young people, and I do that by way of youth evangelism, by helping churches with youth rallies, by doing big events. We have different equipment and things to be able to help do that, whether it be a big ball, a bunch of dodgeballs, or Nerf guns. We have things to come and help churches do special events like that. I don't think that's a long-term fix to bring in young people, but I do know that if you can get someone to come to something that normally wouldn't because of something like that, and they hear the gospel, God can get involved and help them and guide them. And so, if you have any other questions, we have a lot of material on our table, a brochure a little bit about what I was telling you about our camp, and then we have our prayer card, and then you can always go to fernwoodchristiancamp.com and learn more. So, and let me just tie it up there because I'm just trying to wrap it up for time. But going back to verse 4 of Psalm 37, if you delight yourself in the Lord, He'll give you your desires. And I'm a testimony of that. God did it in my life, and I hope He does that in yours, and I hope you don't miss it. I hope you can see that when you delight yourself in God, if you make God the most important part of your life, everything else will fall into place. All right, I'll pray and turn it over to you. Lord, I thank you for today. Lord, I just thank you for what you've allowed me to share. Lord, I pray that you would bless the next service. Lord, I pray that you would help us to realize that we need to surrender to you in the situation and circumstance we're in. Lord, please bless and work in the next service. In Jesus' name, amen.